You're troubled, so you pray. You're distressed, so you cry out for God to bring you quick relief. But all you hear in reply is silence. A silence that is so deafening that it drowns out every thought but one. God isn't listening. Now, this may seem like a bit of a pessimistic way to begin our chat today, but I think I can be bold enough to suggest that these words would possibly speak to every one of us, as all of us at some stage in our life are going to experience a test or a trial at some level. And why do I say that? I say that because we undoubtedly, if we look around and if we're honest with ourselves, we live in a world where such things as greed, evil, corruption, addiction, war, sickness, and death are a very, very close and real reality. And in a world that contains these things, tests, trials, and dark times, I'm sorry to say, are inevitable. We are going to come across them. And there are many ways that people try to get through these times when they find themselves confronted with them. And I think some of the typical sort of Anglo-Australian ways that we try to deal with these trials and difficult times are simply, the first one would be we try to ignore it. And we say if we ignore it for long enough, it'll simply go away eventually. Sometimes we might try to dig down into our work, into our hobby, or into a sport, or anything else that's going to take our mind off that pain. Anything but the pain. We just won't engage with it. And then there are others who try to numb that pain with, sadly, alcohol or with drugs or something along those lines. I would suggest that the average Aussie, including myself, would generally try anything at all that will distract us from the issue or that will prevent us from naming that pain that we are experiencing. But maybe we shouldn't, just avoid these painful experiences or troubled times altogether. Maybe we can name them, and maybe we can even confront them and talk about them. But how do we do this, and where do we start? Well, a good place to start, I might suggest, is with a book that has had a massive influence in shaping our very own Australian culture. And that book's the Bible. The Bible says so much about the struggles of life. And if your immediate thought when I say, start with the Bible is, I have no idea where to start with that thing, I never read it, I don't know anything about it, that's a fair enough thought. That's a fair enough thought to pop into your head. So if you don't know where to start, and as I said, there's 66 books in there. It's a big book. It's hard sometimes to find out where to start. Let me suggest that you start with a book by the name of Psalms. Now, the book of Psalms is a large book, and you find it in the Old Testament, which is sort of the first half of the Bible. Now, this book of Psalms is made up of 150 different Psalms, and each of these Psalms are basically writings, or they can be seen as a sort of a song or a prayer. And many of these Psalms fit into sort of categories, right? There are Psalms of wisdom, there are Psalms of praise, and there are also Psalms of thanksgiving. Cries of thanks and praise to God from what we call the psalmist, the person who's writing those Psalms is called the psalmist. And we mention all those sort of categories like praise and thanksgiving, but do you know what is the most common type of psalm that's found in the Bible? It's not praise. It's not even thanksgiving. But the most common type of psalm found in the Bible are psalms of lament. Now, if you go to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, next to the word lament, the definition will tell you that means to mourn aloud or to regret something strongly. But lamenting is so much more than that. It is so much more than just a definition. Lamenting is an art. And it's an art that for us Anglo-Australians it's pretty much a forgotten and almost unknown practice. But there was a culture that understood and practiced lament far better than we do. And that was the ancient Hebrew culture, which we read about in the Old Testament. And as we think about the tests and trials that many people are experiencing right now in our context, right now in our day, and when they're experiencing these dark times because of the coronavirus, which is sort of hovering above us all like a dark cloud. As we think about that and as we experience today's reality, I want to read to you a really powerful lament from the book of Psalms. And it's a cry from an individual who is suffering through tests and trials. And we find that psalm, it's called Psalm 13. And this is a psalm written by a king. His name was King David. And he writes this psalm directly to God. And I want to read it to you. It's from Psalm 13. This is what it says. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. Just listening to that, there's some pretty penetrating and emotive images in there, aren't there? Now, David, if you don't know much about him, David could have been writing these words for a number of reasons, as he had many occasions or many times in his life where he was persecuted or attacked, or where he just found himself absolutely grief-stricken. Now, one of the times where he could have been writing this, some people have suggested, is he could have been writing this during the time of another king who was King Saul. Now, this King Saul was the king before David became king. And before David became king, King Saul was out to get him. He wanted to kill him. He hunted him down continuously, relentlessly. So some suggested that could have been the time when David wrote this. Other people suggested that it could have been when David's own son, Absalom, was actually trying to take his throne. And him and a group of people were actually hunting David down again, and they were trying to kill him. David's own son was trying to kill him. And there have been others who have suggested that it could have been just David writing about his actual fear and hatred of death itself. But it's not so much the context of when and why this psalm was written that I think is so important, especially for us today. Because it is the emotions that David wrestles with within this psalm that speaks to us today. David talks about this enemy and the fear he has and the anxiety that's coming over him as he thinks and contemplates about this enemy. Now, our enemy today, in our context, might not be some big, powerful king or some evil individual trying to hunt us down and overcome us and kill us. One of our personal enemies could be far more discreet. One of our personal enemies could be some sort of conflict we've had. It could be a secret. It could be a sin. It could be an addiction. It could be mental health. It could be sickness. Or it could, just like David, be a fear and hatred of death itself. We all have an enemy that drives us towards similar to those of David at some stage in our life. But did you notice how the psalm actually finishes? Despite all of David's fears, despite his sadness, despite his grief and his very, very clear feeling of abandonment, David's last words that he writes in this psalm are words of trust and hope. Listen to what he says. As he gets to the end, he writes, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. The key words here seem so simple, but they're so powerful. And they are the very first words, the ones that are the most powerful, I think, are the first 7 words which he writes in that last paragraph. He says, but I trust in your unfailing love. Some people might be hearing that and saying, what? Just trust, right? And if I guess if anyone hears it like that, or even if anyone says it like that, just trust. It feels like a bit of a cop-out, doesn't it? Is the answer simply to trust? Is it that easy? Is that all we get when we find ourselves in these sort of situations? Just trust, you'll be fine. Well, I think it depends. Firstly, on how it's said. You can tell if it's sincere, but I think even more importantly, it depends on what, or more importantly, in who are we placing that trust? If we're going to place our trust in a God who is so transcendent and unknowable and distant and disengaged from us, then yes, trust is not enough. We don't know who we're trusting or what we're trusting. How can we trust in a God, or anyone for that matter, that is not near us and that is not for us? But the God of the Bible is not like that at all. He is not far from us. In the Old Testament, story after story, you find story after story about a God who pursues his people. And why does he pursue them? Because of his love for them. The people of Israel, who were God's chosen people in the Old Testament, they continually rejected him. They offended him, and time after time they turned their backs on him. But God, time after time, forgives them. And he pursues them, and he invites them back into relationship and into restoration with him again and again and again. And then in the New Testament, sort of the last section of the Bible, God goes one step further. And God shows us that he is not a distant God, and that he is one who can be trusted through the very words of his Son, Jesus, who said this. Jesus said, I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. He says that in the Gospel of John. Now Jesus, who is God himself, comes into the world and into our lives as light in the midst of all the darkness that surrounds us, in the midst of the brokenness and despair of the world. And more importantly, the fact that Jesus came into the world shows us that we do not worship some distant God that doesn't care. And when we think about the life of Jesus Christ and his death and on the cross, we see some things that are so encouraging for us and that can actually fill us with trust and hope. We see that he understands pain and suffering, and we understand that because we're aware of his death on the cross and the pain and the suffering that he caused, that he experienced there. We see that Jesus understands betrayal, and we see that through his very own Judas, who was one of his disciples, and it was that disciple Judas who actually ratted Jesus out to the Romans and basically handed him over to them to be crucified. And we also see that Jesus even understands abandonment. All of his disciples, bar one, left him for dead. As he was taken to the cross, none of them followed. They got out of there as quick as they could. They abandoned him. And we can even see when Jesus was dying on the cross that he felt abandoned by God himself. One of the last things he cried out from that cross was, my God, why have you forsaken me? Through all of our trials and our tests, the one thing that we do have to hold on to is the fact that our God, our very creator and our very Savior, is someone who gets it. He gets what it's like to suffer and to go through trials. He knows intimately what it is like to suffer and feel abandoned and to feel alone. To go back to what we started talking about at the beginning, around lamenting. To lament, to cry out, is good. And to lament, it can even be liberating for a person. But how do we do it? And actually, how do we help others into this art of lamenting? Well, there is no exact formula. There are no specific rules that you have to follow to be able to do this. But I just want to suggest one thing in particular to you and to our community as we contemplate this. And that is to lament. A really helpful way that we do that is by doing it together. And I don't mean that we all get together and we stand around and hold hands and we all yell at God together. We can do that if you want. That's not what I mean. But what I'm saying is that we do not have to hide from each other the fact that our lives and that our relationships with both God and with each other, and even in our families, are not always perfect. Honest and vulnerable conversations with each other and with God about our fears and our brokenness can be a form and can be the beginning of a lament. Let me say it again. To lament is good, and to lament is to heal. But I would also add, as we do lament through these tests and trials, let us not forget to whom we are lamenting. We saw it with David. He unashamedly opened up his heart and lamented to God. And I think it's important that we remember that as we do this, because no matter how deep the sorrow or how dark the moment we find ourselves in God, in Jesus, there is always hope. There is always understanding, and there is always a God who promises us that he will be with us in the darkness, that he will be our light in the darkness. Take care of yourself. We are here for you. I want to say that again and again. And I just want to thank you for being with us today. God bless.